throughout Jesus' teachings, Jesus sort of intensifies certain commandments in the Torah, such as in some antitheses on murder and adultery. In other areas, he relaxes Torah regulations, such as with Sabbath regulations and questions about cleanness and disputes about purity. He reaffirms the Torah constantly throughout his teachings, and
Mhm.
it seems like he reverses certain kind of motivations for commandments in Torah. For example, the
Yeah.
antithesis about eye for eye, tooth for tooth. In Deuteronomy, the motivation is that you shall purge the evil from your midst, that Israel shall hear, fear, and be pure. Jesus kind of reverses that whole thing with radical love, dare I say pacifism, and he references the Torah all the time. Queen of the South, Solomon, Sign of Jonah. He quotes from the Psalms and Isaiah and Genesis, but he also seems to rebuke, or I don't know if that's too strong a word, but he rebukes certain parts, such as in the antithesis about fulfilling your vows to the Lord. He says, "Do not swear an oath by heaven or by earth, and anything more than a yes or no is from the evil one." And so it seems like Jesus upholds, but also kind of adjusts the Torah with his with his self-conceived sense of authority. So, do you think it'd be right to characterize him as something like a semi-liberal with respect to his regard on the Torah?
I wouldn't use that language. And I certainly wouldn't call Jesus an antinomian. So Jesus is a Jew. He
Right.
lives within Torah. He assumes its authority. But I think there are at least two things to say here, maybe three things to say. So the first thing to say is that Jesus uh, believes that he is on an all important mission. And if that mission requires something that means an individual will not fulfill a commandment in Torah, then the kingdom Jesus trumped that. For example, he calls a person in the so-called Q text, if you believe in Q, but it's in Matthew and Luke. He calls an individual, "Come follow me," right? "Come follow me." And the guy says, "I got to marry my dad first." Well, in Judaism, burying your parents belongs to the Decalogue. That's one of the ways you honor your parents. And if you don't bury them, you're dishonoring them and you're breaking Torah. So Jesus is there. Let the dead bury their own dead. Jesus is saying, my commandment, my demand trumps that imperative in this case. This is not a general teaching. Nobody should honor parents anymore. That's not what's going on at all. Judaism recognizes that commandments can come into conflict. So, for example, in the book of Maccabees, um, the nation is suffering because its enemies have discovered that, hey, the best time to attack is on Saturday. These people are resting. It's the Sabbath. So if we attack them on the Sabbath, we'll win. And the leaders, the Maccabean leaders said, you know what? We have a choice here. We can keep the Sabbath and we'll all die, in which case there won't be a nation anymore to keep the Sabbath, or we'll fight on the Sabbath, we'll break Torah, but it is ultimately the right thing to do. Or again, the rabbis would discuss what happens when you're supposed to circumcise on the eighth day, but that turns out to be Saturday, turns out to be the Sabbath. You can't fulfill both commandments. You can't rest on the Sabbath and circumcise on the eighth day always. So Judaism recognizes that there are conflicting imperatives. In fact, there's a really interesting passage in the Babylonian Talmud where it says that when the prophet like Moses shows up, you should obey him, even if he asks you to disobey a commandment in the Torah. And then it notes, as an aside, well, Elijah offered a sacrifice on Mount Carmel, and you're not supposed to do that. You only sacrifice in Jerusalem. But sometimes, you know, according to the needs of the hour, that's what it says, the needs of the hour, one um, imperative trumps another. And I think that's part of what Jesus is doing. That explains why he calls somebody away from burial duty, which would seem like breaking the Decalogue. I also think that Jesus, because he's oriented to the eschaton, because he's thinking of um, the end, is also thinking of the beginning. The beginning will be like the end will be like the beginning. Um, the eschaton will restore God's will as it was before the fall, and everything went poorly. If you look at Mark 10, Jesus says at one point, "Well, from the beginning it was not so." It appears that the imperative uh, not to divorce is a reversion back to a pre-fallen state, and that Moses's uh, legislation on this is a concession to sin. But in a world where sin will be gone, evil will be defeated, there's not going to be any need for uh, divorce proceedings. Same thing with swearing oaths. Good grief! In the New Age, nobody's going to swear an oath. Why do you need an oath? In the world to come, there will be no dishonesty. Everybody will tell the truth. The only reason you have oaths is because people lie. The world to come, people aren't going to lie. There's not going to be any need for oaths. By the way, I should, as a footnote to all this, just simply observe that if you look at Matthew 5:21 through 48, these so-called antitheses, if you obeyed all of them, if you obeyed Jesus, you would not be breaking Torah. If you don't get a divorce, you're not breaking Torah. There is no command to divorce in the Torah. If you don't take an oath, you're not breaking any commandment in the Torah. If you simply tell the truth all the time, you're not breaking Torah. If you turn the other cheek, you're not breaking Torah. So you have to think practically too. What does breaking Torah mean? The last thing to say is that when, for example, Jesus is accused of breaking the Sabbath, Jews themselves debated what Sabbath keeping meant, how far you could walk, what things were allowed, what things were disallowed, and Jesus is part of that conversation. And I think that all of his actions on the Sabbath, you could find some parallel to them in Jewish sources. So he's certainly not what you would call it antinomian, but he is in a different situation. The new is come, as it says in what Matthew 11, the law and the prophets were until John. They're not gone, but they have a different force and a different application in view of the kingdom of God, which brings a new state of things. So there's a long, rambling answer to your question about Torah.
No, I appreciate that. It seems like in your explanation of how Jesus views on the Torah are within the bounds of Judaism, because there were lots of perspectives within Judaism, but one kind of distinctive thing about Jesus is that he views himself and the people of the world as in this new messianic age of righteousness, and that kind of explains a lot of his attitude toward the Torah. Is that correct?
I think so. Although, there are also practical things that we never think about, and we should. So Jesus isn't just going around um, uttering halakhic rulings randomly. Um, Now, let's say Mark 10 does have the Pharisees coming up and asking him what he thinks about Moses and divorce. So that's presented as a sort of theoretical halakhic um, discussion. But Jesus also had disciples. He had hearers. He had men and women who were following him around. And you always have to ask yourself, what did they make of this? What they would have made of this was, oh, I can't get divorced. If Peter is thinking of leaving his wife because he finds Mary Magdalene attractive, that's not going to be an option, right? Um, so you also have to ask how these things are actually lived out by the people who are following Jesus around, and Jesus has to be conscious of that, right? So anyway, we often just sit back and think of Jesus as though he's a rabbi, as though it's a discussion in the Mishnah, and he has leisure to ponder these things. But I'm guessing that for all this stuff, there were practical things going on and practical repercussions to what he was saying.